Yeah, I think we are on. Please, Shanta, continue the session. Thank you.
Hello everyone. On behalf of Dhaka University Research Society, I, Mahmi Alam Shanta, warmly welcome you all to the third session of our exclusive online training session on electoral research. We truly appreciate your presence and continued participation in this certified international program designed to strengthen our understanding on elections, electoral system, and research methodologies. Before moving forward, let's take a moment to reflect on what we have learned so far. In the first session led by Dr. Taniel Vidya Taisi ma'am, we are introduced to the foundation of democracy, elections, and electoral research, setting the theoretical groundwork. The second session built upon that by discussing research design, literature review, and the methodological approaches essential for conducting electoral studies. These two sessions have already enriched our understanding, and today we are ready to dive even deeper. The third session will focus on a highly practical and crucial area, quantitative research and polling in politics. In an era where data and surveys shape political campaigns, media narratives, and even election outcomes, understanding polling method and quantitative research is vital for any aspiring researcher. We, we are truly honored to have with us once again Mr. Joshua Rosenblum, political consultant and former resident program director of the Bangladesh International Republican Institute. Many of us will remember him from our second session where he joined us alongside Daniel ma'am and Romanuddin sir. It's truly a pleasure to have him with us once again. Sir, on behalf of Dhaka University Research Society, I extend our heartfelt gratitude for being with us today. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very good. Thank you for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I was very happy that Danielle asked me to sort of drop in and talk about quantitative research, polling. As I mentioned in the second session that we had, I'm not professionally a pollster. It's not my job, but I have worked in a lot of campaigns, worked with pollsters, have commissioned and read a lot of polls during my time as the resident program manager for the International Republican Institute in Dhaka. We did polling, which I worked very closely with our pollsters in designing and interpreting the results. So, as I understand, my goal here is to sort of give you guys an overview of how polling and quantitative research is used in electoral campaigns and in politics. I will say that this is going to be necessarily brief to give sort of the overview of everything. It's obviously extremely deep field with lots of complexity to it, but I'll try and keep it as brief as I can. I afterwards go through questions and see if people want to have further discussions. So if that's okay, unless anything else needs to be done, let's see if I can share a screen with a presentation with you guys. Let's
Wonderful.
see.
Sure, obviously, without any further delays, I'd like to hand over the floor to our special guest. Sir, the session is yours.
Sure. Okay. I've supposedly shared. Here we go. All right. Can everyone see that? All right. Let me just make sure that I can do a slideshow. There we go. All right, so everyone can see that, right?
Yes,
All right.
sir, we can see this.
So, I mean, basically, quantitative research, for the most part, although not exclusively, but polling certainly revolves around the concepts of probability theory. And probability theory is, statistics and trying to and the ability to make predictions based on certain laws of probability, which basically were figured out, at least starting in the 1600s, by people who were gamblers and trying to figure out how to predict cards. So it's always an interesting, the history of probability is interesting. Why polling works? Well, I mean, polling works because usually not practical to ask everyone in the population, their viewpoints on what they think. So trying to do polling at students of your university, it's not practical to go and ask every single person or every single student what they think. So we need to create a smaller group, which we call the sample, that will adequately represent the larger group. If that sample is chosen carefully and follows statistical principles, follows the laws of probability, it actually can reflect the opinions or behaviors of the entire population. The metaphor I like to use is creating sort of a kettle of soup, like a large, maybe 15-liter kettle of soup, right? If you are mixing salt into the soup, you want to figure out if there's too much salt, if there's not enough salt, what the proper level is. You don't need to drink the entire 15-liter kettle of soup to figure out whether or not it needed more salt, right? You can take a spoonful and you can taste that, and you can then try and figure out whether you need to add, or maybe you put too much in, that sort of thing. So the key thing is you don't need to drink that whole pot. If the pot is mixed properly, you can tell what the rest of the soup tastes like from one spoonful. The problems we run into are basically known as bias and error, right? Bias occurs when a poll systematically favors certain outcomes over others. So basically, if you had sort of a film of salt at the top of the layer of the soup and you took the sample directly from that top layer, you would get a skewed result, right? The results wouldn't represent the whole pot, whole 15-liter pot of soup. So bias makes your results unreliable because they don't really reflect the entire population. The other thing is error. Even when there is no bias, even if you had a perfectly representative sample, even if you had a perfect survey instrument, there's still room for error. Any human measurement contains error in it. So even with a good spoonful of that soup, you might not get the exact flavor every time. So it's called a sampling error. And that's normal. It's expected. Basically, the way polls work is they give you confidence that the true value, as we say, the actual absolute truth, lies within a certain range rather than an absolute number. Pollsters use statistics to estimate the size of the error, which helps us understand how close those results are going to be to the actual absolute truth. So the way we do this is through a process of sampling. Basically, as it says here, sampling is a process of selecting a smaller group of people to represent the larger population. The key is to make that sample representative, meaning that it reflects the diversity of the population in all sorts of characteristics: age, gender, ethnicity, education. So as an example, if you're surveying your university about cafeteria preferences, you'd want to include students from different majors, different years, different campuses, if that's applicable. If you only sampled engineering students, your results wouldn't represent the entire student body, and it would contain bias towards the preferences of those engineering students. So how's this done? Random sampling. Everyone in the population, when you create a sample off of a population, has to have an equal chance of being selected for the interview. This would help avoid bias. And also there's stratified sampling, where the population is divided into groups by year or gender, and a proportional number of people are chosen from each group to try and make sure that you are getting the right mix from various types of different populations. And basically, to go with the metaphor of the kettle of soup, you're trying to mix the salt. You're trying to mix the soup really well so the salt is evenly spread throughout the soup, so that any one spoonful you pick out of it, you taste, will be representative of that larger sample. So there are a couple of key terms that we use in polling. One is confidence level and one is confidence interval. They both use the word confidence. So confidence interval is usually expressed in, to avoid confusion, the concept of margin of error, right? A confidence level of any poll that you see, and any poll that you look at, they should tell you right up front what the confidence level is. If it doesn't, that's suspect. Confidence level basically tells you how sure the pollster is about the results. The standard is a confidence level of 95%, which basically means that if you repeated this poll the exact same way 100 times, we're pretty sure that the actual result, whatever the true result would be within the same range 95 out of those 100 times. Now, of course, that means that 5% of the time, the true result will be outside, that. So it's like there's still error that's involved, but 95% confidence level is considered to be sort of the industry standard in trying to do polling. The other is a confidence interval. Like I said, it's also expressed as margin of error. The confidence interval is the range within which the true population value is likely to fall. The actual true number will fall. We're 95% sure that it will fall within this range. So if for example, if a poll showed that 60% of the students of the cafeteria food with a margin of error, like the cafeteria food with margin of error 3%, the true percentage will be between 57% and 63%, right? So the confidence interval for that is 6, and the margin of error is plus or minus 3, right? So when you see a poll and it says the margin of error is plus or minus 3, that means within that range of 6 points, we're 95% sure around that the true value would be within that range. So together, this gives us a sense of how much we can trust the poll's results. Smaller confidence interval and a higher confidence level will make the results more reliable. That means, of course, that you have to have more people in your sample. The major constraints on polls are always time and money. So you may see polls that have a confidence margin of error, say 5%. Sorry, a confidence interval of 5%, right? Margin of error of 5%, which mean a confidence interval of 10%. That 10% band is pretty large. Or you may get more of a sample, but that takes more time, takes more money to get that margin of error down to maybe 3 or maybe 2%, which would be confidence interval of 6 or 4%. That makes the poll more accurate. But like I said, we're always working under real world constraints. So there are, trade-offs that are used. All right, so another concept to understand is the improbability is whether or not your sample is statistically significant. So to use the soup metaphor once again, right? If you obviously don't need to drink the entire kettle of soup, the entire 15 liters, to figure out whether or not the soup needs more salt, right? But if you just took a drop, just maybe you put like your pencil in it and just took a little drop and you tasted it, you probably also couldn't get a good enough sample of the soup to make a decision on whether or not you need to add more soup, right? You need to have enough so that the sample is what we call statistically significant. In other words, that it's not the sample that you get and the information you get is not just due to random error. So basically, laws of probability, I once, when I was in grad school, could tell you the math. I'm not so sure I could do that anymore, but it really isn't necessary for this discussion. Basically, you just need, for any population size that you're modeling, you need a certain number of respondents in order to make that result be statistically significant, to make it, better chance than just random that the results are correct. So again, what you have is you can't use just a drop of that soup, but you can take a spoonful. You can take it as long as it's well mixed, as well as the sample is randomized. You can have a good idea of whether you need to add salt or do something else with it. Now, this also means that the interesting thing about statistical significance is as you want more accuracy, or as the population that you're modeling becomes larger, in order to be more accurate, the statistically significant number is not as much as you might think it would be. And this, again, getting back to the soup metaphor, you can taste the soup with a spoon and get a good idea of whether you need more salt. You could also take an entire cup, an 8-ounce cup, and drink that, and try and figure out whether the soup needs more salt, but are you really getting more information from that 8-ounce cup than the spoonful? Yes, you are getting more information from it. It will be more accurate, but not that much. So you only need to get to that statistically significant number in order to be able to figure out, as long as your sample is well mixed, randomized, and selected properly, and the survey instrument is not biased, you should be able to have an accurate count of what you're trying to model. So the how large you need is dependent on the population size, right? Your university versus the whole country. The numbers needed for statistical significance plateau with the population. That's what I was just talking about. The margin of error you're willing to accept and the confidence level you want. So for example, for a +5 margin of error and a 95% confidence level for a university with 10,000 students, you probably need to survey around or get responses back from about 300 students. Well-mixed, randomized sample of 300 students. It's much smaller than the whole population of 10,000, but it's statistically significant enough to reflect the population accurately. Now, if I can, once again, see if I can share a separate thing. All right. Here we go. Okay. So can everyone see this? It's a sample size calculator. Has everyone got it? Or, all right. So just to give an explanation, this is just an online calculator. You can find it. You can find it anywhere. If you were surveying a population the size of 1,000 people, if that was the total population you were trying to model, for a 95% confidence level and a margin error of 3, or confidence interval of 6, you would need to sample. You need responses back from 517 people to get a statistically significant number. Now, if we want to say do that for 1 million people, right? If your population is 1 million people you're trying to model at the same confidence level and margin of error, you need to sample about 1,056 people, somewhere in that area. Say we wanted to model 100 million, right? Does anyone have any idea or guesses in terms of like what the sample size would need to be in order to be statistically significant? Any guesses? Anyone? All right. Well, to go from 1 million to 100 million, you just need 1,067, right? So when you're dealing with small populations, that number starts to go up quickly. But then again, it's like the metaphor with the spoon versus the whole cup. You're not getting a lot more information the more that the larger that you have to, the more that you have to model. So the amount for statistical significance plateaus with the increase in population. So you can actually do a very good poll with a little over 1,000 people modeling a country of 100 million voters. So that is not always quite intuitive, but a lot of times, that is frequently the case. So let me get back to the other presentation. Okay. So basically the summary is polling works because it's based on sampling. Smaller group can actually reflect the larger population if it's representative. Like I said, it's based on the laws of probability, which are in many cases, well, not in many cases, in all cases, very solid. You can predict with great accuracy larger populations from good samples of smaller populations. And really, it's just mathematical. It works out. A lot of times where people get gummed up is that sometimes polls are not that great, or they have hidden bias in them in terms of the sampling, or they have a hidden bias in terms of the structure of the survey instrument, the poll itself. A lot of times, and I will get into this when we're talking about the polling, we have to weight the polls because we don't have enough of each sort of subgroup. We don't have enough women versus men, or we don't have enough younger people versus older people, or students versus employed people. And pollsters will typically then weight the sample, and that's a little bit of an art, not as much of a science, so that's where things can go wrong. But the math itself, in terms of being able to generalize that larger population from a small population, is actually very solid and very predictive. As I mentioned, bias skews the results unfairly, while error is normal, but you can quantify it. You can quantify it through confidence level and confidence interval / margin of error. Sampling involves choosing a group that mirrors the population's diversity, has to have that random sample. The confidence level shows how sure we are, and the confidence interval shows the range of possible results. So even when it says that 52% of people think X, it's really not 52%. We're confident that the true number is within that range of the confidence interval. A statistically significant sample is large enough to provide an accurate result without polling everybody. And as I said, using probability, we can model large populations with small samples. That saves time and resources while maintaining accuracy. And everything is basically dealing with those restrictions in time and resources. So let me set up another presentation here. And that is the overview. It's a very quick overview, but we are limited for time. Okay. Okay, survey research itself, polling. There are different types of surveys, different types of polls. They all use mostly the same types of structure. They're based on probability, based on statistical laws. So, but we use them for sort of different things, right? One might be, as you say, feasibility tests, right? Used to assess a candidate's viability. So if you have a candidate who wants to run, they may start doing polling to see like whether or not, they have a legitimate shot at winning an election, what their name recognition is, what the likelihood of their election or maybe re-election is. We do benchmark polls. These are very comprehensive polls and long-term polls. They also evaluate things like name recognition, but also really they're more important for issue preferences of the electorate as a whole and demographic insights. Which types of people within the population hold certain issue preferences, right? It's also mapping the electorate. What the size and the profile of like persuadable people are, the size and profile of your base voters, the size and profile of your opposition voters. And when you're talking about issue preferences, often benchmark polls will measure what they call salience, how important an issue is to any one particular group of people. In other words, you may have groups that always say that immigration is in the is very important to them, right? Or rather is in like a top issue for them. But compared to other issues, how important is it? Is it number one on their list? Is it the thing that they are going to vote on, or is it number 5 on their list? And salience is very important because there can be a lot of things where you may actually have small groups of people who are in favor of something, but it's very salient to them. They will go out and vote on it, whereas other people have many more mixed motivations. In-cycle polls. These are conducted to during campaigns to address errors and adapt strategies. So in other words, in an in-cycle poll, you are doing polling in order to test a message. We've come up with a certain message that we're trying to direct to a certain group of voters. is that message resonating with those voters? Are they responding to it? Or do we have to back off and try and figure out something else to do? You know, are we, you can do testing and optimizing message, right? So you can test within the sample group and within subgroups of that sample group. Does message A work better than message B? Yeah, what is going to motivate them to vote more? Message A or message B? A lot of strategy is based on these sort of things. You want to, this is also what we would call the horse race poll. Many people, when they think of polling, they're thinking of the horse race. They're thinking of like the head-to-head numbers between candidates. Candidate A has 46% of is ahead against candidate B, 46 to 42. People love those numbers because it gives you something to like, you know, it's you know, literally the horse race. In many cases within the campaign itself, during the cycle of the campaign, it's one of the least important polls. You want to do a good benchmark poll when you start out in order to understand what your electorate wants and how to craft your messaging towards certain groups within that electorate to get you to the point where you can get to a plurality or a majority of the voters. Of course, again, it's important if you're behind or if you're ahead to know these things so that you can course correct. But the in-cycle polls and the polling is really, the more information you get is more of when you're trying to figure out what it is that your voters want. Also, they will do polling to model turnout. In other words, you're asking people, are they going to vote? What does the turnout look like? Are there going to be more young voters than older voters? Are there going to be more women voters than men voters? And like I said, and we'll get to this in a little bit, when you're weighting certain demographics, you're using information that you've gleaned from polls in terms of trying to figure out and trying to model what the turnout will look like, because turnout is never the same from election to election. You can gain insight from the past, but you know, the turnout models are different from election to election. Pollsters are constantly trying to accurately model what the electorate will look like on election day. Also, surveys in terms of what you've been going over with Tanyel. There's a lot of qualitative research that goes on, focus groups and interviews for in-depth insights. There's modern techniques like scraping information from the web, you know, in terms of trying to figure out what people think, what people are interested in, what engages them more, what is most salient to them. Focus groups and interviews. Or sometimes what we call intercepts, where you might like be snagging people on campus at random and trying to figure out what their interests are, who they'll vote for, things like that. All the qualitative research as we've been talking about is very useful. I mentioned that you do polling in cycles sometimes to test messaging, but you can really start to go in depth of what people think about message in qualitative research and focus groups, because you can't just do it really from you can't go back and forth essentially on a polling instrument. It's kind of sort of yes or no, or you know, pick this one over this one. You can start to, you know, try and get better ideas with qualitative research, but qualitative research is not statistically sound. In other words, you can't predict anything off it. You can't say that the general population or the general electorate will look like this because of my focus groups. And one last thing that is all over the place. In the United States, it's also in other places that I've worked, in Eastern Europe or in the Arab world, something called push polls. Push polls are actually not really polls. They are essentially messaging operations, right? They're aimed to persuade. They're not meant to collect data, right? So they're a little misleading. You would do a phone interview, or you know, like, and say I'm from this polling group, and you know, did you know that candidate X took money from whatever corporation that pollutes our groundwater and that sort of thing? Would you be more likely to vote for him or less likely to vote for him, right? It's in the guise of a poll, but it's really a message. It's messaging to a certain population. It's kind of deceptive. It's not data collection. And there is a lot of it out there. As a campaign hack, I look at it as messaging like any other messaging tool, but it is kind of deceptive, and it's most certainly not a poll. It's not something that you will be able to use in order to get useful information out of. So the basics of polls, I mentioned that our constraints are always resource driven. Polls are often expensive. In the US, ranging from like 2,000 to 35,000 for benchmarks for a congressional district. Could go even higher. Comprehensive polls involve complex questionnaire designs that sometimes can go wrong if you have bias in them and have hidden bias that you don't catch. Larger sample sizes for accuracy. Like I said, you need to get to a statistically significant number in order for it to be accurate. But also, often polls will oversample. They will get larger amounts than they need for just that statistical significance. Because when you start to break down the polls for advanced data analysis, when you start to look at what we call the crosstabs, so it's not 42% of voters think X, but rather you have the subgroups underneath it. Demographic usually, but it can also be other types of subgroups. 24% of women say X, but 42% of men say Y. When you break down into those demographic groups, those numbers also have to be statistically significant for the population that they're modeling, right? And if you don't have enough, then you can't really tell anything about those subgroups. You can't tell anything about those demographics. So while you may need 1,067 respondents to model a population of 100 million people, polls will often oversample much larger than that to make sure they have statistically significant numbers in all the key demographic subgroups that they want to be able to tell things about. Sampling techniques. The importance of representative sampling, I mentioned before. You need that sample to be representative to avoid bias. It can have error. Error will always be in it, but error is random and error can be controlled for. You can't really control for bias if you allow it to slip into the polling. So therefore, we need to get as random a sample, as well mixed a sample, as well mixed that pot of soup as we possibly can get it. When you're talking about in-person surveys, which is the way we did the surveys in Bangladesh at IRI, you have literally, you call them enumerators, people who are recruited and trained to conduct polls face-to-face, house to house. So what you have there is you create the sample by essentially picking out what we call primary sampling units, PSUs, right? And that can be certain areas within an upazila, or it could be the upazila itself or whatever like that, and then randomly assign those PSUs. And then randomly assign other sampling units within those PSUs. It's a multi-stage cluster sample. Then you get down to a certain neighborhood, essentially, after you've randomly picked all these neighborhoods from these different upazilas and stuff. And then you, the numerators go and they randomly pick houses. They will essentially do what they call a random walk. They will pick a number out of a hat, or roll a die or something like that. Say the die comes up 3, they go to the third house on the left, right? And then they go to the next third house, and they go to the next third house, always picking out these houses essentially from doing a random walk based on a random number. And then even within the household, they will use something usually called a Kish grid to try and pick out randomly a person within the household. So you're not always dealing with, say, the man head of household who is answering the door, right? You are picking at random people within the household based on a certain randomized grid. That's pretty good at getting you a good random sample. The way we did it in IRI, I think tend to be pretty good. Sometimes you have to have good quality control. Sometimes you have situations where enumerators, they get paid to do this, and they're usually not professional enumerators. They don't do it for a living. They are students or somebody else who get recruited for a couple of weeks, and they get trained and they go out and do it. But sometimes you find people who fill in the surveys themselves, and then just do stuff at random, and then say, and you have to be able to back check those and be able to control for it. But generally, it's pretty good at getting that random sample that you need. If you're doing telephone surveys, something called random digit dialing, which is essentially computer will randomly dial phones within certain codes and essentially get people on for phone polling. And that is a good way to randomize that sample. You can also use registration-based sampling for people who are on the voter rolls, and you can have essentially sort of a computer pick individual people who are on the voter rolls at random. There are still challenges to this. Obviously, first of all, for doing in-person surveys, that's your most resource intensive way to generate a random sample. It's very good, but you have to hire people. It takes a long time. You have to go out and do a lot of back checks. You have to make sure that you pick out at random maybe 10% of the surveys, and you go back to the house and say, did this person come to your house 3 days ago or something like that? That sort of thing. Try and make sure it's quality, you have good quality. Phones are easier. And they're less expensive, but also you have a lot of non-response bias. And you have a lot of coverage areas a lot of times in places where there's not good phone connectivity or cell phone connectivity. Non-response is becoming a very big issue in the United States. I know when have my cell phone, if I see a number that is not somebody I know, I don't answer it. I let it go to my voicemail. And non-response used to be 20 years ago not an issue at all, and it's becoming very much an issue now, because if enough people don't respond, then you're getting a response bias. The people who are answering your polls are people who, for whatever reason, like to answer polls, and that can creep in bias. And then, of course, you have unlisted numbers, or you have demographic discrepancies. So phones do have that issue. Again, it doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means that you have to be cognizant of all those issues. You'll probably have a larger margin of error or confidence interval in those types of surveys, but they are faster and they are cheaper, and we deal with the resources we have at hand. A very important thing is the survey design itself. You need clear and unbiased language, which is crucial for reliable responses, and especially in places where you have different dialects or you have different languages, you need to be able to back check those questions and how they're worded, and how the audience responds to them. You need to avoid complex or leading questions. The question shouldn't be like driving an answer. It shouldn't be getting people to lean towards one or the other. Sometimes this is subtle and you don't pick it up really quickly enough, and that's where bias can creep in. Also, you don't want it to be very complex. Sometimes there's a little complexity. It's more than a yes or no situation, but you might say rank order your preferences of certain issues, or you might try and figure out salience by other means, or you might be trying to figure out certain messaging. You give them certain options for messaging with different wording, but you want to try and keep it as simple as possible, because that will obviously make it so that they're easier to answer. You'll have better responses, response rate, and you'll have better responses. So the type of questions that you're interested in: information, demographics, issues, gender, age, education level, things like that. Their knowledge of certain facts, whether they're aware of certain things. That could be just something like, say, name ID. Are you aware of this person or this candidate? Have you heard their name? And then opinions, their attitudes and judgments. What do you think of candidate X? What do you think of this policy? What do you think of this issue? How important is it to you? So, as I mentioned before, there are other survey techniques, focus groups, which allows for explanation of nuanced opinions. Like I said, polls really tend to give you, because you need to keep those questions simple. They can't really give you nuanced answers. You can't follow up. You can't try and tease out certain things. Focus groups are very good for that. They require skilled moderators to manage the group dynamics and try and keep everything on track and try and not make sure things, that you don't really have you don't have too much bias. I mentioned intercepts. So quick responses from various demographic groups and public spaces. You're on the university campus, you're in a public square, you're at random picking people and you're trying to interview them to try and get information from them. Web-based testing, which is very cost effective and scalable. It's not face to face, but you essentially catch people like from the web, have them coming for an online poll or interview and that sort of thing. And these actually can all yield very valuable data, but as I mentioned before, they can't be extrapolated to the overall population because they're not statistically rigorous. They're not based in the laws of probability. You can't say that because my focus group found this, that people respond well to this message, that will be applicable to the entire population. You need to do something that is statistically based. Quality control. 3 main error types: instrument error, in other words, the survey itself that you're giving to people, it has poor wording or sequencing of questions. Sequencing is very important, the rank order of things. You need to often, when you're giving people multiple choices, you need to randomize those choices so that the same one is not always the first choice. Or sequencing of the questions themselves is confusing. Sampling error is always an issue. Inaccuracies due to sample size, limitations. We're always trying to use the least sort of resources. Obviously we want to get as good sample size as we can. But if the sample size is not large enough, or if it's, especially when we're talking about those subgroups, like I mentioned before, or if it is not randomized well, you're going to have sampling error. And then non-observation error, basically totally missed demographics or response gaps. So if you did phone polling via cell phones, unless you controlled for it, you might have non-observation error in that you are not polling anybody who doesn't have a cell phone. And that could be significant. So it's very important to try and do meticulous design and execute well for those accurate results. Again, I mentioned push polls. They're just really a technique for messaging. They're not really polls really at all. Most professional pollsters and polling organizations think it's unethical. So that is basically my presentation. If you guys have more questions, let me stop the presentation here. If you guys have more questions, deeper questions, I can try and answer them with the time we have left. I think we have about a half hour or so. So yeah, please go to it. Anyone? Anyone at all? I can't have been that clear.
Yeah, Shanta, can you hear us?
Yes, ma'am.
Please continue with the question answer session. Sir has finished that presentation.
Sir, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so I had a question. So what if those who did not participate in the polling hold completely different opinions from those who did?
Right. Well, that would be an example of non-observation error, right? So if you have a group of people, like I said, a good example would be people who don't have cell phones, and you only use cell phones as your to deliver the survey instrument to those people, to do polling for those people. You're going to have non-observation error, which will skew the poll. Now, like I said, if you have a well randomized sample that includes, demographically speaking, all the people you're trying to model, I would say all the people who are all the voters, all the people in the electorate, then you shouldn't have a situation where you have significant numbers of people who believe things different from what you would come up with in the poll. If you had, say, a person people in favor of more immigration versus less immigration, just to use an issue, right? If your poll comes and it says that 54% of people favor less immigration and 46% of people favor more immigration, those numbers should be generally correct and attributable to the entire population, whether or not someone was polled or not, because anybody who was polled, anybody in the population has an equal chance of getting polled, right? In other words, if you're doing a random sample, whether it's through door-to-door random walk type of situation or random digit dialing or random picking from voter lists, things like that, as long as that sample is sufficiently random, as long as that soup is mixed well enough, any portion that you take, any spoonful you take, should be representative of the larger whole. So those numbers should be correct. But like I said, if you have a situation where non-observation bias can creep in, usually in terms of like bad sampling methods, then that can affect things. But any person who is not polled, and most people won't be polled, right? Most people, only a very small population, maybe 1,000 something people will be polled out of 100 million people. Most people won't be polled. But again, if it's statistically significant, you have enough of those people, and that sample is well mixed, that soup is well mixed, it's randomly generated, you should be able to model the larger population pretty accurately.
So here is a further question actually. So what if someone manages to predict or manipulate the random pitch selection process, thereby deliberately influencing the result of a statistically designed poll?
What if someone actually is able to, let me just make sure I have the right question. So what if someone is actually able to modify the poll or somehow, work it so that it is no longer a random sample, right? So it's no longer that they've messed up the poll purposely. That can happen. Obviously, pollsters try very hard to make sure that it is not the case. Like I mentioned with, and this does happen. It's not, I experienced it in Bangladesh. I experienced it with other polls. When you have enumerators, the people who are taking the surveys door to door. Like I said, that's a lot of people that you have to hire, and they're not professional enumerators. They don't do it for a living. They don't do it all year, every day. So you get a bunch of people to work for several weeks, and you train them how to do it. And sometimes they're lazy, and sometimes they are. They will do things like they will say, "Oh, I went to all these houses, but you didn't really go to all those houses," and he filled the stuff in just by himself. But there are ways to try and control for that. One is what I actually liked when we were doing Bangladesh is technology allowed us to control for that. So instead of using paper, we used electronic tablets, like an iPad, but not an iPad, but tablet based. But what that allowed us to do was to be able to see where they went. In other words, it's GPS linked, so we know they went to this house and they went to that house and they went to that house. They didn't just go to the cafe and fill in everything by themselves. Also, we know how long it took for each survey to happen or each survey to be conducted. And that face-to-face surveys, those surveys that we did, should take around 20 minutes. So if each survey was done in like a minute, we know something's wrong. And then you go and you fire that person, and you add more people into your sample, at a random basis, and you get up to the numbers that you need to get in terms of respondents. People who are maliciously trying to, or just trying to skew the poll, or who are just lazy, they happen. But there are lots of controls that pollsters use to try and make sure that they're able to catch that and be able to correct it. And of course, pollsters have very big incentive to do that because they want to be as accurate as they can. If they get a reputation for being very sloppy, then no one will hire them. So like I said, it can happen, but there's a good pollster will have a lot of checks in place.
Okay, so here is the next question. Shwat Hossain Alif asked, What is the key difference in how researchers might mitigate lessen the effect of an instrument error, a sampling error, and a non-observation error?
I'm sorry, what was the key difference?
Yep. What the key difference is in how researchers might mitigate lessen the effect of an instrument error, a sampling error, and a non-observation error.
Oh, the key difference. Okay, sorry. Well, the differences are just in the modes in which you're dealing, right? Obviously, it's like for here, let me just bring up my little slides again for myself. Okay, so for instrument error, the way that you try and mitigate it is that you, well, first of all, I will say a lot of things in polling are actually already sort of, you can look back at other polls and you can see where things went wrong, and you can try and you can mitigate that way. So there are a lot of standardized questions that over the years, it's become standardized because we know that they work very well. It's like, one question that we use very useful is like, do you think the country's on the right track or the wrong track? And we know how to word it, and we know how to collect it off, that it's a very simple question. It encompasses a lot of what we want to try and figure out about how people are feeling about the current government, current administration. And it's very simple, like I said, and over a long period of time, that question has kind of been standardized because it's very easy. If you're coming up with new questions, you want to try and make sure that they're worded as clearly as possible. You want to make sure that, like I said, the sequencing of questions is clear, that you don't have questions with similar subjects all over the survey. That makes it sort of like difficult to answer. You want to make sure, like I said, if you have multiple options for a question in your survey instrument, you want to make sure that those options are constantly rotated by the enumerator or whoever's doing the interview, because there's just the primacy of place bias. It's just a human bias. It's like whoever's listed at number one or whatever options listed at number one is going to get more response. So you rotate through those. They're basically ways that are not very complex, or not even they're not counterintuitive in terms of trying to make things as clear as possible, make sure the wording is clear as possible, the sequence is as clear as possible, that the survey itself is not too long. Sometimes the surveys get too long, you start to get drop off, you start to get people who are like not going to finish the survey, or they towards the end they start to get mentally tired. It starts to they just start running through things. So basically with instrument error, it's about trying to use standardized questions, trying to make sure questions that maybe have not had big history of having been asked before in other polls, a novel question, just making sure that you're trying to get any sort of bias out of it that may sway the respondent. For sampling error, there are, again, a lot of methods that are used that have been very well trod paths, right? In other words, so when you're doing face-to-face interviews, door-to-door interviews with in-person enumerators, that's very well established techniques on how to do that, how to randomize that sample. In other words, how to randomize the primary sampling units, how to randomize the subunits within those units, and how to get to I mentioned randomizing. It's called a random walk sequence, where you randomize the houses that you get to. And using certain techniques to make sure you're not always getting the same person at the door, to get to the number of response you want. Those are very well outlined, and although the process is a little complex, actually executing that is really not that big a deal in terms of just making sure that you have that random sample. It's harder when you get to things like phones, because phones, you can do random digit dialing, and it's very good, but like I said, it excludes people who don't have phones, right? And then what you will have to do is sort of wait and kind of guess how many people don't have phones, and try and wait for that and trying to cover them in a certain certain way. And that's also the non-observation error. You have to try and figure out, and this is sometimes tricky, am I missing a key demographic? Am I missing a key portion of the electorate or the population that I want to model? And sometimes that's not always obvious, and only becomes obvious in retrospect. Again, there are a lot of ways that pollsters have been doing this for a long time. But as I also mentioned, 20 years ago, non-response error was not an issue. And now it is. I think we're getting response rates. Gallup, which is premier pollster polling operation worldwide, is getting response rates of 6 to 7%, I think, off of their phone polls at the moment, and that's causing sort of an issue. It's causing a problem because it's requiring people to start doing weighting much more than they would have had to do in the past. And like I said, the weighting, when you sort of like, what you're doing is essentially you're compensating for certain demographics. Like, you don't have enough young people, so you weight the results of the young people you get 1.2%, or 1.2 times, and to cover up for that result. But that's, again, sort of an art form, not so much a science based in math. So therefore, people are starting to have problems with that. But a lot of that, trying to compensate for those errors, is like I said, already sort of well-established territory, and some of the techniques I laid out are ones that are very common to try and compensate for that.
Okay, do we have any more questions, Shanta?
I don't think so. No, we don't have any
Okay,
other questions.
just to the audience, if you have any more questions, you can raise your hands and directly ask sir here. No issue. Do any of the participants have any live question? Well, if we don't have any more questions, we will definitely have to end the session, no problem. But if sir would like to sum up what we have learned, and if I would like to ask sir to give us some advice on uh, how to conduct electoral research. Overall, your session, you discussed the polling related issues and the quantitative and qualitative research methods and mixed methods, and also the sampling errors and a lot of terms. So when suppose we are undergraduate students, as we all are here, and we are focusing on the national election, which will be happening on Bangladesh, like on February, if I'm not wrong. So some of us are also planning like a 2-3 person group. We are planning to conduct researches on our election and electoral process, PR system, and like other necessary systems, and what people's are thinking about, what people's observations, and like their perspectives, and a lot of things, etc. So how would you like to suggest us or give some advice on how to conduct these types of research, and what would you like to put emphasis on? Like, should we go for qualitative research or quantitative research, or what would be best for us as undergraduate students, please, sir?
Right. Well, I mean, I'll say up front the last part. You probably are not going to be doing a lot of polling. Like I said, polling does take a significant amount of resources. If you wanted to poll, I think the electorate was expected to be about 119 million people, right? So you need to be able to do a poll using either in person, which would be the most resources, or maybe phones or that sort of thing. And you need to get responses back at least over 1,067 people, right, to be statistically significant, with a plus or minus 3 points margin of error and a confidence level of 95. You could expand those, but of course it would be less accurate at that point. But as undergraduates, I think probably what you're going to be doing more is looking at polls that are taken, or that are done by media groups, they're done by political organizations, they're done by other I would have liked to have said that IRI will be doing polling going up to the election, but as I mentioned in our other session, the United States government has decided that we no longer do foreign aid, so we are no longer in Bangladesh, or we actually will be opening up a small office again in Bangladesh, but we'll not have the resources to do countrywide polling. So I think the thing for you guys in doing your research is absorbing the polling that's being done for the elections in Bangladesh and being able to discern what's a good poll from a bad poll, right? So in other words, when you are looking at to sum up essentially what we talked about here, when you're looking at any poll, you want to look at how that poll was done, right? You want to make sure that poll was conducted well. So you want to make sure that you want to look at the confidence level, right? Like I said, generally the standard is confidence level of 95%, meaning that if we did this poll 100 times, 95% of the time, that answer would be within our range of, a range of possibilities. You want to know what the confidence interval is, or the margin of error. Also, margin of error is usually expressed as plus or minus. So a poll with a plus or minus 3 points margin of error has a confidence interval of 6, meaning that we're 95% sure, kind of 95% sure that the true number will be within that 6-point range. Of course, that means that 5% of the time, that number is out of that 6-point range. Could be like very far out, but that's sort of the industry standard of confidence level and confidence interval. And you want to make sure that the sample size is statistically significant. And like I said, you could look at an online calculator for statistical significance. You can tell whether or not the population they're trying to model, if they have enough respondents to be able to be statistically significant. Now, if you have the opportunity, you want to be able to figure out, again, how that poll was conducted. Was it conducted in person, door to door? If so, how did they actually do that? How did they generate that random sample? Is that sample, is using techniques which will generate a really good randomized sample, well-mixed pot of soup, or are they using phones? A lot of polls that I saw that are supposed to like polls in Bangladesh are web-based, meaning that, they put out on the webpage of the newspaper, questions and people respond. But obviously, what's the problem with that? Right? I mean, it's a huge non-response error. It's a non-response bias, because only people who looked at that newspaper online, people who had access to the internet, people who looked at that newspaper online and then who chose to answer that survey are the people who were surveyed. And it's not a random sample, right? It's not a random sample that's generalizable to the larger population. And often they are gamed, because then political forces will then try and get their supporters to make sure that you vote in this poll, but things get messed up. So I don't think as undergraduates you guys are going to be doing a lot of quantitative polling research, just because of the resource problem, but you want to be able to use that within your research plans to be absorbing the quantitative research that's done out there for going up to the elections, and being able to discern which are the good polls versus the ones that are suspect.
Okay, sir. Just to add on to that question I asked, for example, in our country, when we need to publish some research papers online or in any international journals, we need to have a certification from the International Review Board, which we have in our country, like in our university, Dhaka University. It takes a certain amount of registration fee to get that certification, and it has a process. So and later on, we as the students, we have to pay the fee, and then we have to publish our papers and submit them to the international research organizations. So how is this process going on? Because this international review board thing, it takes a lot of money as we are students, and also when we will be going on doing this international researches, or research based on the electoral system, we have to, it's not possible for us to move on at the 64 districts of Bangladesh, like all over Bangladesh. We can't go on. Like you said that we have, so we must, or we should focus on the polling groups and what they had the media groups discussed or researched on. But if we have to do some sampling, and if we have that kind of capability, or people, students, movement, and helping us, is it possible for us to conduct research fully based on the whole Bangladesh system? Yeah, I know that it's not possible for us to take data from 170 million people, but is it possible, at least, how about we do take at least 10 people from 64 districts all over Bangladesh, like 640 or 100 people from each district, 6,400 people's data. And then what we do is that all those data will be from different criteria, different types of people, different religion, different category. And then we sum it up through our softwares and other skills. And later on, if we publish it through online or social or whatever in the international journals, can we get that international review board certification and whatsoever? Like, if you would like to just give us some advice, please.
Right. I can't give you a lot of advice in terms of the International Review Board because I never had to deal with it in Bangladesh myself. Any research that you guys publish in any sort of journal or anything has to be approved by the government first, or just as a question?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, like we have to get it reviewed by a certain group of institution. After that, we have to go for the, like, it's a certification for the authenticity of the data and the research.
right.
That's what we
And
call it. Yeah.
right. And I mean, obviously that takes money. Do you actually do you pay it as part of an organization, say like the Research Society, or does each individual
No, each
student or each?
individual, each is, even if it is a student or non-student, they have to pay a certain amount of fee to get that International Review Board certification.
Right.
It's like $300.
Oh,
Yeah.
per student, right? That is hard. That becomes more of a fundraising issue for the university and for your organization. I can't really say at this point because I don't have experience with it. I can try and think about it and see if I can come up with a sort of ideas. But yeah, I mean, large difficulty in working in Bangladesh or working in other countries I've been is often there are sort of government or bureaucratic obstacles which make it difficult to be able to adequately, do that polling. I mean, obviously, people who are pollsters in Bangladesh or the media organizations which hire those pollsters or like that, they can afford probably the fees to do that research. But for individuals, it becomes more of a problem. I can't really give you a good answer at this time. I really have to think about it. Maybe we can sit down with Tanyel and we can sort of discuss things and see what we can come up with. As far as your suggestion about interviewing people, say 10 people in each of the districts, right? 64 different districts. So that's a total of 640 people. I mean, first of all, you can do that, but what that is essentially, that's 64 separate sort of kind of almost like focus groups, right? It's not going to be generalizable to the larger public for a couple of reasons. So one is, first of all, you need to be able to pick out those people at random. The people you're picking out, the 10 people in each district you're picking out, you have to pick them out at random so that any other person in that district basically has an equal opportunity to be picked, right? In other words, however many people there are in the district, anyone is just as likely as another to be picked to be one of those 10 people. And you'd have to be able to structure your sampling to be able to your sampling structure to be able to do that effectively, which I'm not sure if you guys can do. It's not complex, but I mean, it does take work to do that. But more so, you probably wouldn't want to take 10 people from every district because different districts have different populations. So if you're trying to model the entire electorate of Bangladesh, not one certain area, the number of people you pick from the number of people you pick from Dhaka to be totally representative, the electorate as a whole is going to be larger because it's a denser population in Dhaka than it would be in another, in another district. So you can't just take 10 people from every district. That, like I said, I don't want to get down on that because again, you're essentially you're taking 10 people in each district to sort of do interviews, focus groups, that sort of thing, which can be useful qualitative data, but it's not going to be that sort of quantitative data. It's based on statistical probability laws. So you would you might have the ability, I'm not exactly sure about your resources and things like that, but you might be able to do it in a smaller area. I mean, you might be able to do research in terms of like just using the population of Dhaka University. But of course, as I also said, that the number you need to get to statistical significance with smaller numbers is not that much larger, is not that much smaller than you would to model a larger population group as well. Like the amount you need to, it rises very quickly. So for like 10,000 people, it's like 500, and for a million people, it's 600 something, for a million people, it's 1,000 something. And then for 100 million, it's just a little more than that. So, but you could you can do all sorts of research that doesn't have to be countrywide. It can just be in a smaller, discrete area, the university, Dhaka itself, or a certain particular area, which may be within your reach. And I'd be happy to take a look at anything you come up with if you're interested in doing that.
Thank you, sir. I will definitely show it to you later on. We are working on it. Yes, sir. Thank you. Shanta, sir, if you permit us, we would like to conclude this session. Yeah, Shanta,
Very
please
good. It's
carry
been a
on.
pleasure. I'm very happy Tanyel asked me to drop in on this. So yeah, it's been great. So I wish you all the luck in the world. I wish I could be there actually, but such is the case.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an insightful and engaging session. We truly appreciate the depth of knowledge and practical perspective you have shared with us tonight. To all participants, thank you for joining and staying active throughout. Please don't forget, attendance in these sessions is required to receive the exclusive certificates. So we look forward to seeing you again in our final session. With that, we officially conclude today's program. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye, sir. See you
Bye.
next time. Yeah.
Goodbye, sir.
মাইদুল ভাই, থ্যাংক ইউ। কথা হবে আপনার সাথে।
Thank you.
আপনি হিরো হয়ে গেছেন ভাই, হিরো। রেকর্ডটা অফ করেন।
কিভাবে